Hi, good to be with you today. Ecclesiastes. We've been in these books of the Bible that are what we call the shorter books, the small books, however you want to say it, but those books of the Bible that you can read through in 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, and they're kind of scattered throughout the Bible. We've looked at Esther, we looked at Jonah, we've looked at Lamentations. We today are looking at a book called Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament is part of what we call the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. The wisdom literature in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures is the book of Psalms, the book of Proverbs, Song of Songs, or sometimes called Song of Solomon, the book of Job. It talks about why bad things happen to good people. And Ecclesiastes is one of those books in the wisdom literature. Now, it's real important that before we even look at it to understand what the purpose of this stuff is. Okay? Wisdom literature, we just say it this way, is descriptive, not prescriptive. In other words, wisdom literature kind of defines and describes for us what this life is, but it doesn't prescribe and say, this is how you ought to live. A good example of this is the book of Psalms. It's part of the wisdom literature, and sometimes the psalmist is saying, oh, God, how majestic is your name in all the earth. The world's full of your glory. The trees of the field clap their hands. And he's not saying literally the trees of the field clap. He's saying poetically, this is how I feel. I just sense your presence so real, God. And then sometimes the psalmist wrote, my God, why have you forsaken me? You may recognize that as the psalm that Jesus quoted when he was hanging on the cross. Or the times when the psalmist said, God, humiliate my enemies. Just humiliate them. I want them to suffer. I want their families to suffer. You go, whoa. Is that a prescription how we ought to pray? Well, no, intuitively it's not. It's a description of how we feel sometimes. Have you ever felt like you'd like your enemies to be humiliated? I won't ask for hands. But that's what this wisdom literature is. I like the way Rabbi Shai Held says. He says it's putting language to the wonder and the horror of being alive. Wow. Isn't that what poetry does for us? It gives language to our lives. So if you order a book of poetry online this week and the book of poetry comes and you open it up and read it, you're probably not reading it to find out how you can save on your auto insurance. Probably not why you're reading poetry. You probably aren't even reading poetry to find answers to your quests. You're probably reading poetry, and in that you're connecting when words are given to your experience. And that's a powerful, powerful thing in our lives. Don't ever underestimate that. I bet everyone in this room has had those times in your life, and we call them aha moments, where you read something, you heard something, you went, yes, that's how I feel. Yes, that describes me. And all of a sudden you felt seen, you felt recognized, you felt like maybe my life isn't a chaotic mess. Maybe there's some sense to it because someone put words to your experience. And boy, that's what the book of Ecclesiastes does. It puts words to our experience. There's debate about who wrote the book. A lot of people think that Solomon did, King Solomon of Israel, one of the sons of David, king of Israel. But the word Ecclesiastes means the preacher or the teacher. And it connotes this thing of a person who stands before the people and teaches them or preaches at them. And so if you want to, you can kind of look at Ecclesiastes as a sermon. But I got to warn you, it doesn't start like any sermon I've ever preached or I've ever heard, and you probably have ever heard. It doesn't start that way. I know when you preach, you're supposed to get people's attention at the beginning and all that kind of stuff. Tell a funny story at the beginning or something to get people's attention. Well, he doesn't do that. He starts out this by saying, meaningless. Meaningless. It's all meaningless. Life is meaningless. It does not make any sense. Pointless is one of the translations. One translation is, it's just smoke. It's just vapor that disappears. You ever hear someone say it's all smoke and mirrors? Well, that's what he's kind of saying about life. He says it does not make sense. It is meaningless. If you read from the old King James Version growing up, he would say, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It's just meaningless. I always think, if you were looking for a church home and the pastor got up and said, life makes no sense at all. It's pointless. You'd go, wow, this is not exactly what I had in mind looking for a church. This might be First Church of the Nihilists or something like that. But he doesn't stop there. He just keeps going. First chapter of Ecclesiastes. He says, well, what does a person gain from all their labor? Generations come, generations go, the sun rises, the sun sets. He says, streams flow and they flow back. He actually, even in the first chapter, he says, this is exhausting. All these words are just exhausting. Because people want to tell you what life is. People want to tell you how much meaning there is. And he says, I'm just not seeing it at all. And it's funny, in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's some phrases that pop out that we still use today. They're still in use today. Have you ever heard someone say that someone's just chasing after the wind? Seems like there was a song called Chasing After the Wind. Well, that's straight from the book of Ecclesiastes. Or one I used to hear my mom say, there's nothing new under the sun. We've all heard that, right? I think my mom tried to say that to encourage me, but that's not what he meant when he said it. When he said there's nothing new under the sun, he's saying, whatever you're going to do has been done before. Whatever's been done before is going to be done again. We're not going to change this world. There's nothing new under the sun. He uses a phrase that is still a religious phrase, but it's still in use. It says, from dust we come and to dust we will return. That, of course, is a reference to the poem in the first chapter of Genesis. The first creation account is a poem, and it says that he created us from the dust of the earth, from all the elements that are in the trees and the grass and the mountains. He took those elements and formed us. And, of course, it says he breathed into us the spirit of life. So it's a positive thing for us. We use that phrase on Monday, Thursday, don't we? From dust we came and to dust we return, because we're looking toward the crucifixion and resurrection. So it's a very positive term for us, but he's not using it that way. He's saying, I was nothing before I came, I'll be nothing when I leave. What is the point? Or another way he says it, and I love this, he says, naked I came into the world, and naked I will leave. Paul says that again in the New Testament. And to me, that's always been a perspective giver, right? I brought nothing into the world. I'm going to take nothing out of it. I thought that's perspective. But to him, he says this is a hopeless kind of feeling. So now that he's gotten my attention and your attention to saying, you don't want to quit reading there. It's just not a good time to quit reading the book of Ecclesiastes after you get through the first chapter, or it'll be a really depressing week for you. But he does describe what he tried to do to make meaning out of this. So the first thing he says is he thought, I'm just going to go for pleasure, okay? I'm just going to go for pleasure, because who knows how short this life is. And since it doesn't really have any real significance, if I could just make myself happy, good, let's go for that. So he said, I went for pleasure. He said, I denied myself nothing. If this was Solomon who wrote it, it was a very wealthy person, but it sounds like it was a wealthy person. He said, I denied myself nothing. All the wine I wanted, all the food I wanted, all the stuff I wanted, I denied myself nothing. He said, but it ended up being meaningless. And of course, we kind of know why it's meaningless, because pleasure is a gift from God, but if it's all you want in life, it doesn't last long. You don't have pleasure 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so if you're looking for meaning and pleasure, it'll be here for a while, but then it can be gone. And most of our lives isn't in pleasure, it's in other things. It's in work. So that's the second thing he tried. He tried toil and work. There's got to be meaning in that. And there is meaning in work, right? We all believe that. Good work has good meaning. He says people toil under the sun, but he said as we toil and work hard, we have those times where we go, why am I even doing this? Have you ever had a job like that? I've had jobs like that. I'm going, man, this isn't stimulating me. This isn't growing me. Why am I even doing this? Well, I knew because I like to eat, and so that's what, but he says, but to find fulfillment in toil. And he says, so what if I toil and work really hard? What if I build something? Whether it's a kingdom or a business, or what if I build something and I'm not going to be a foolish man who just squanders everything? What if I build something and I really work hard? Wisdom, I really make it right. And then he says, what if then the person that I pass that down to is a fool and he squanders it? And all that work was for nothing? He said, it's just meaningless. And then speaking of wisdom, he thought, well, that would be it. If I could be very, very wise. He said, I would pursue wisdom, but he said, but nobody's going to remember that because he's thinking fools don't even recognize wisdom. So he finally says, virtue. I will become a virtuous person. People will see me as a good person. Of course, that gets tricky because he kind of recognizes that no one is 100% virtuous, People are virtuous, but they're not perfect. And even bad people do good things sometimes. And so virtue is kind of a sliding scale. But here's what he said about virtue. He said, I've seen everything in my pointless lifetime. The righteous person may die in spite of their righteousness. Then again, the wicked may live long in spite of their wickedness. And that's putting words to our life, isn't it? He even goes further in, and in the middle of this gives quite a little poetic stance of this life that we live in. Not prescriptive, but descriptive. This is on page 5 in your zine. You might want to look at this as I read it. And some of you will recognize this. Some of you who are a little older, remember the song Turn, Turn, Turn? Remember that, some of you? I see white heads going like this, yes. That was actually written by Pete Seeger in the 50s, way before my time. And that's not funny. And then in the 60s, who did it in the 60s and made it famous? You're right, the Byrds. Yeah, the Byrds. And so if you don't know what we're talking about, I read it, you'll go, oh yeah, I think I did hear that song. But here's what he says. There's a season for everything and a time for every matter under heavens. To everything, turn, turn. There's a season. My wife is sitting there going, I can't believe he's singing in church. Okay. There's a season for everything and a time for every matter under the heavens. A time for giving birth and a time for dying. A time for planting and a time for uprooting what was planted. A time for killing and a time for healing. A time for tearing down and a time for building up. A time for crying and a time for laughing. A time for mourning and a time for dancing. A time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones. A time for embracing and a time for avoiding embraces. A time for searching and a time for losing. A time for keeping and a time for throwing away. A time for tearing and a time for repairing. A time for keeping silent and a time for speaking. A time for loving and a time for hating. A time for war and a time for peace. Now, when I was younger, I didn't really understand the purpose of that. I thought he was being prescriptive, and I thought he was trying to say, well, there is a time you should kill. There is a time you should hate. There is a time, and that just didn't go with my mind at all until I realized he's just saying, this is where we live, y'all. He's just putting words to our existence. And we go through times, especially if we live pretty comfortable lives, where we're just amazed when evil enters our life. We're just amazed when pain comes, and it does startle us and it does surprise us. And then we get to a point where we go, but of course, pain comes to everyone. That's what he's putting words to for us. Now, like the book of Proverbs, he gives some wisdom in terms of in kind of that Proverbs form. If you ever read the book of Proverbs, it's one of the books in the Bible you don't need much context. There's just a line or two of these truisms, it's just Proverbs. I used to call them tweets from God, but Twitter doesn't exist anymore. It's now X, so I guess texts from God, those short little things. And he does some of those in the book of Ecclesiastes. And then we get toward the end of the book, and it's like, okay, time for solutions, right? I mean, we get what's going on with life. So what's the solution? It's so abrupt and so short that you're actually disappointed by it at first, because I think we misunderstand it so much. Here's what it does. It comes down to the end, Ecclesiastes 12:13. He says, so this is the end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep God's commandments. This is what everyone must do. We're dismissed. Huh? I mean, that's not much. And I got to tell you, I'll just be honest with you. Throughout the Bible, whenever I read fear God, everything in me, y'all, any of you feel that way? We'll go, oh, wait a minute. I mean, come on. Look at the New Testament. What does Jesus keep saying? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. At the birth of Jesus, the angel said to the shepherds, don't be afraid. Said to Mary, don't be afraid. Said to Joseph, don't be afraid. Jesus is going to be crucified, and he says to his disciples, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And so when the writer of Ecclesiastes says fear God, and that's not the only time it's in the Bible, it just doesn't feel right to me. So there's actually ones in Acts where it talks about God-fearing people, and that's kind of the phrase people use, he's a God-fearing person, which means he's a good person, which is kind of weird, right? Or sometimes when we're really mad, we're going to say, I'll put the fear of God in that kid. Yeah. I heard sermons when I was a kid that put the fear of God in me, but I don't think it was the fear we're talking about. So this word, we got to look at this word. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's called the Septuagint. This was translated between the 3rd and 1st century BC. So this was the translation that probably Jesus read from many times, and what the disciples would. The word there for fear is phobos or phabu. And phobos is where we get the word phobia from. And so sometimes it means fear. You ever had a phobia? I'm pretty claustrophobic, and not quite as bad as I used to be. But when you're claustrophobic and you're in an elevator and the elevator stops between floors, that's happened to me a couple times. Your heart rate goes from here to here, it's like terror fear, and it doesn't make sense, but you're still scared. So it can mean that kind of fear. It can mean terror or horror, but it can also mean like respect. And that's how it's used with people. And this is so weird that I could say I fabu this person, and I could mean I have deep respect for this person, or it could mean he terrifies me. It's a strange word. And so it's the word used in the Bible. And many people, in trying to translate it, the best they can come up with is awe. Awe. Be in awe of God. Why would that be an answer to any of our problems? Why would that be something you'd say after telling me how crappy this world can be? Be in awe of God. I think maybe this can make some sense if we look at another phrase in this letter. And if we take this thing of being, in awe of God and put it in this context, that's what Ecclesiastes does for me. I'm going to give you my favorite verse in the book of Ecclesiastes, and one of my favorite verses in the Bible. This comes earlier in the book, in the 3rd chapter. It says, God has made everything fitting in his time, but he has also placed eternity in their hearts. He's saying God placed eternity in the hearts of human beings. What does that mean? Well, again, this is a word that has multiple meanings. It's the word Iona, from which we get our word eon. And so it's usually translated in kind of a time thing, like eternity and of time. But the problem is we think of eternity as like, a line, like it's a linear thing. And eternity is a much more ethereal thing than that. In fact, this word designates big things that transcend anything else. One English translation of this is not that he placed eternity in the hearts of men, but he placed the world in the hearts of man. He placed the entire world in the hearts of man and woman. He placed something bigger than us in us. Whenever I get to preach at Christmas time, I always love to emphasize that the incarnation of Jesus Christ into our world was that God became man. And I always like to say, eternity entered time. See, that's what I think it was when Jesus came. Eternity entered time. Eternity came to our place here. And the Ecclesiastes writer is saying, to be in awe of God is to understand where God is and to understand that he has placed God here for us to comprehend. And I think what that does for us, it does a couple of things. First of all, I think the fear of God or the awe of God is simply humbling myself. I think when we look at God, who's beyond our comprehension and beyond our ability to describe, it humbles us. This is a simplistic illustration, but I always come back to Lake Superior. Man, I love the Great Lakes. Carol and I have lived in Michigan for, close to 40 years now. And I came from Indiana, which is rife with cornfields and good people, but we came to Michigan and we discovered the UP. And I vacationed up here when I was a kid with my parents, but there's something about the Great Lakes, and Lake Superior. Don't we love Lake Superior? Because it is, we all know, the biggest, the deepest, the coldest body of fresh water in the world, so we love it. But I remember times when I'd sit on the shore of Lake Superior and the kids would be playing and stuff, and it'd be one of those days, and you just like to listen to the surf, don't you? You just like to listen to the surf. I love those days when you can do that. And there's a smallness that you feel. You've heard me say this before. There's a smallness that you feel and a humility you feel, but it's not an insignificance. In fact, when I sit there, I feel more significant. I feel humbled. I feel small in comparison to God's creation, but I feel a great significance because God invited me to Lake Superior. God was there at Lake Superior. That's where we were. And I think that what the writer to Ecclesiastes is saying is you got to understand that to be in awe of God and to be humbled before God is to know that he has placed that in you. He has placed eternity. He has placed infinity. He has placed God himself inside of you. That's why the New Testament says that God is over all and through all and in all. Where the New Testament says that Christ is over all and is all. Where Acts says, in him we live and move and have our being. See, I've come to this conclusion over the year. Well, I don't want to ever say I came to a conclusion because I'm still trying to learn, but over time, my concept of what it is to walk with Christ has changed so much. And one of the things is in what we call our spiritual practices. Some people call it spiritual disciplines, but that freaks out some people, so we say spiritual practices. Leave the door open. And we usually think of things like, prayer and worship and fasting and reading scripture and fellowship and simplicity and things like that. Practices. I used to think that those were designed to train me to be a better Christian. If I did these things, I'd become a better Christian, and it was still performance-oriented. I'm going to get this done. I now believe that overwhelmingly, the spiritual practices are mainly for me to learn how to see God right now. Me to learn how to see God today in this space. Today, for me to see God in you in the embraces and the handshakes, to see God in my family, to see God in the rain and the humidity, to see God all around us. See, you and I go through our lives, and it's so easy to see anything but God and thinking that we only encounter God at these certain times and what he wants to teach us. And this takes a lifetime. I will never achieve this. I'm still working on it. I will the rest of my life. What he wants is he wants me to see him today. He wants me to know his presence today. Is that the answer to all the problems in the world? No, not if you're looking for cognitive answers. We spend so much time in Christianity trying to explain everything. Explain, are you believing this? Are you believing this right? Instead of saying, do you believe in your heart that he is with you right now? Do you know he is with you? Do you know how deep the sorrow is? And emotively, you won't feel it, but he is still with you. I had a phone call a couple nights ago from my brother, and his granddaughter is going through the heavy throes of leukemia. They said the summer is going to be a nightmare when the chemo is at its strongest and everything like that. And, we're just saying, no 16-year-old should have to do this, and we're not feeling good about that. But my brother kept saying, but God has been here. God has been with us. He says, you look at her. She doesn't have any hair. She's all swollen. She's all discolored. And you just can't imagine your grandkid having to go through that. He didn't have any answers. But God is with us. But God is with us. And when I hung up, Mark seemed to be saying, for now, that's enough. And that's what I think the Ecclesiastes writer is saying. I think he's saying that to be in awe of God, understand that he's placed eternity. He's placed his presence inside of you. At creation, he breathed into you the breath of life. He breathed into you the Spirit of God, and that is inside of you to hang on to. There's a writer named Frederick Buechner. Some of you have probably read Buechner. He's kind of a poet at heart, even though he's a preacher. And he has a good way with words. I want to read a quote for you. This is on page 2 of your zine. This is one of those quotes. You might want to cut this out when you get home and stick it somewhere, because this is one of those great quotes. And I feel like this puts in perspective some of what the writer of Ecclesiastes is saying. He says, the grace of God means something like this. Here is your life. You might never have been, but you are, because the party wouldn't have been complete without you. Here's the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. I'm with you. Here's the world. Beautiful and terrible things will happen, but don't be afraid. I am with you.